The year was 1874, and the Arizona desert spread out under a wide blue sky, quiet except for the wind whispering across the rocks. The sun was still high and heat shimmered above the ground like ripples on water. At Fort Bowie, a small outpost built of sun-dried bricks, a few soldiers rested after a long day of patrol. The land around them was dry and harsh, full of sharp cactus, twisted trees, and red canyons that cut deep into the earth. It was Apache country, a place that never seemed to welcome strangers. Corporal Henry Vance stood outside the fort gate, staring at the mountains that rose in the distance. He was a man who had been in the army for many years, but he still found this place strange and hard to understand. The silence, the sudden wind, the way the shadows changed shape at sunset, everything here felt alive in a way he could not name. Still, he told himself, a soldier must not think too much. Orders were orders, and the land was only a place to cross, not to fear. That afternoon, a few men were sent to check a small water spring that lay between two ridges. The spring was one of the few sources of fresh water in the area, and the soldiers often stopped there to fill their canteens. The trail to the spring was narrow, with sharp stones underfoot and cliffs on both sides. Dust rose around their boots as they walked. The heat pressed down on them like a heavy blanket. Private Ellis, a young man with a cheerful grin, was the first to notice movement near the rocks. "Look there," he whispered, pointing to a small figure by the edge of the spring. She was a young girl, no more than 13 years old, kneeling beside the water. Her hair was long and black, braided neatly with tiny beads that caught the sunlight. She wore a simple brown dress made from deer hide, and around her neck hung a small necklace of shells. Her hands were cupped, lifting water to her lips. For a moment, no one spoke. The desert was so still they could hear the trickle of water and the faint buzz of insects. Then one of the men muttered, "An Apache." The word broke the silence like a pebble tossed into still water. The girl turned her head sharply, eyes wide and alert. Her face was calm but watchful, like a deer that has heard something behind it. "Wait," Corporal Vance said quietly, raising a hand. But the men were already stepping forward, their boots crunching on the gravel. The girl froze for a heartbeat, then stood up and took a step back. When Ellis called out, "Hey, don't run, we won't hurt you," she turned and sprinted toward the canyon. It happened so fast that none of them had time to think. The men looked at each other, surprised, then laughed. "She's fast," Ellis said, already starting after her. The others followed, shouting and calling to her to stop. It was half a chase, half a game. None of them thought it would lead to anything more than a short run. The corporal sighed and shouted after them to be careful, but his words were lost to the wind. The girl ran like the desert wind itself, light and quick, her small feet barely touching the earth. She darted through bushes, jumped over rocks, and slipped between the tall stones like a shadow. The soldiers tried to keep up, but the ground was rough and the heat was rising. The sound of their boots echoed through the canyons, mixing with their laughter and calls. Somewhere ahead, the girl's braid flashed in the sunlight before she disappeared behind a wall of rock. After an hour, the corporal began to worry. The men had not returned. The sun had moved lower in the sky, painting the cliffs with shades of red and gold. He stood by the spring, waiting. He could still see the trail of dust they had kicked up, but it was growing faint. "They'll be back soon," he told the others at the fort when they asked. "Just chasing a girl, nothing more." But the hours passed and evening came. The desert turned cool and long shadows stretched across the ground. The sky filled with colors, pink, purple, and then deep blue. Coyotes began to call in the distance, their cries rising and fading like songs. Still, the 5 men did not return. At first, no one wanted to believe anything was wrong. The soldiers at the fort joked that the men had probably found shelter in some canyon and would walk back in the morning. But inside, Corporal Vance felt uneasy. He had lived long enough in this land to know that it was not wise to chase someone into the wild. The Apaches knew every trail, every hidden spring, every place where a man could lose his way. The mountains were full of paths that went nowhere, and of silences that could swallow sound completely. That night, the corporal could not sleep. The wind blew softly against the fort walls, making a sound like whispering voices. He sat near the gate, staring at the horizon. The desert looked calm, but he knew better. There were stories among the older scouts, stories of people who wandered too far into the canyons and never came back. Some said the land itself chose who could walk upon it. Others said the mountains had spirits that guarded them from outsiders. Vance did not know what to believe, but he felt the weight of those stories now. Before sunrise, he gathered a small search party. 5 men and 2 Apache scouts who worked with the army agreed to go. The scouts were quiet men with sharp eyes. One of them, named Nantan, warned the corporal, "If she was from these mountains, she will not be found unless she wishes it." Vance nodded. He did not argue. They set out as the first light of dawn turned the desert gold. They followed the trail as best they could. At first it was easy. Footprints in the dust, small and light, followed by heavier boot marks. Then the track split where the canyon widened. One scout knelt and touched the ground. "They were running fast," he said softly. Then they stopped here. There was a single boot print near a pile of stones, then nothing. The trail simply ended. They searched farther, climbing over rocks, peering into gullies, calling out the names of the missing men. The canyon echoed their voices back at them, empty and hollow. They found a rifle leaning against a rock, the metal warm from the sun. A few feet away lay a canteen with the initials EH scratched into the side. It was Ellis's. But there were no signs of struggle, no tracks leading away, no footprints of the girl. Only silence. As the day grew hotter, they continued deeper into the mountains. The cliffs seemed to close in around them, and the air became still and heavy. Every sound, the buzz of a fly, the rattle of a pebble, felt louder. The men began to whisper as if afraid to disturb something unseen. Around noon, they reached a place where the canyon opened into a wide valley, filled with tall grass and strange rock towers. The scouts stopped at the edge. "We do not go there," Nantan said quietly. "That is sacred ground." Corporal Vance looked out at the valley. It was beautiful and strange, the kind of place that seemed to belong to another world. He wanted to keep searching, but the faces of his men told him not to. They had seen enough. With a heavy heart, he ordered them to turn back. The missing soldiers were never found. When they returned to Fort Bowie, the sun was setting again. The air felt colder, and the fort seemed smaller than before. The story of the lost soldiers spread quickly, first through the camp, then to nearby towns. Some said they had been caught in a rock fall. Others whispered that the Apache girl had led them into a trap. But the scouts said nothing. They only shook their heads and looked toward the mountains, where the last light of the day faded into the shadows. That night, as the stars came out one by one, Corporal Vance stood alone outside the fort. The desert stretched before him, endless and silent. He thought about the girl, small, quick, and fearless, and about the men who had followed her into the wild. The wind carried a soft sound through the canyon, like distant laughter or maybe the sigh of the earth itself. Whatever it was, it made the corporal shiver. Somewhere out there, the desert had taken them, and it was not planning to give them back. The sun rose slowly over the Arizona desert, painting the land in gold and red. The air was cool at first, but everyone at Fort Bowie knew that by noon the heat would press down like fire. Corporal Henry Vance stood near the corral, his hat pulled low over his eyes, watching the sky brighten. The missing men had been gone 2 full days now, and not a sign of them had been found. Inside the fort, the other soldiers tried to keep their minds busy with daily chores, polishing boots, checking rifles, tending to the horses, but the air felt heavy with worry. When they gathered for breakfast, nobody spoke much. The clinking of spoons against tin cups was the only sound. Finally, Sergeant Miller broke the silence. "They're not coming back, are they?" Corporal Vance looked at him but said nothing. He didn't want to answer. He didn't know what to believe himself. The commanding officer, Captain Doyle, ordered a new search to begin that morning. This time they would cover more ground and stay out longer. Vance was placed in charge of one group, along with 6 men and 2 Apache scouts who knew the area better than anyone. One of the scouts, Nantan, had warned him before. The land out there keeps its secrets. By mid-morning, the group was ready to leave. Each man carried a canteen, a small pack of food, and a blanket rolled behind his saddle. The scouts rode ahead, their eyes scanning the ground for any mark or trail. The desert stretched before them, endless hills of stone, thorny bushes, and pale sand that glowed in the sun. At first, the journey seemed calm. The soldiers spoke softly to each other, trying to keep their spirits up. They followed the same route the missing men had taken toward the spring. When they reached it, they found everything just as before. The small pool of clear water, the rocks, the dry footprints near the edge. But beyond that point, the trail grew faint. The scouts dismounted and began to walk, bending low to study the earth. One of them found a broken branch. Another pointed to a faint mark that could have been from a boot. They came this way, Nantan said quietly. But the wind is hiding their path. They moved on slowly, careful not to lose the trail. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher and the air shimmered with heat. Sweat rolled down their faces. The land was silent except for the sound of horse hooves and the soft rustle of dry grass. Around noon, they stopped to rest under a rocky ledge. The shade felt cool against their backs. One soldier took out a piece of hard bread and chewed thoughtfully. "You think the girl's still out here?" he asked. Nantan, sitting cross-legged on the ground, nodded. "If she is one of the mountain people, she will never leave. This land is her home. You will not see her unless she wishes it." The men fell silent. The desert around them stretched for miles, full of hidden places and shadows. It was easy to believe that someone could disappear here and never be found. After a short rest, they continued deeper into the hills. The path wound between high cliffs, their red walls shining in the sun. The farther they went, the quieter it became. Even the wind seemed to fade. The only sound now was the crunch of boots and the creak of saddles. Suddenly, one of the scouts stopped. He pointed to the ground. There, half covered by dust, lay a small strip of cloth. It looked like part of a soldier's sleeve. Vance picked it up, turning it over in his hand. The fabric was torn and the edges were dry and stiff. "They were here," he said softly. The men exchanged uneasy looks. "Then where did they go?" No one answered. The canyon ahead split into two narrow passages, both dark and shadowed. The scouts studied the ground carefully but could not tell which way the missing men had gone. Finally, Nantan said, "We will take the left path. The other leads to a place we do not enter." Vance didn't ask why. He had learned that some questions in this land did not need answers. They followed Nantan down the left path, the walls of the canyon rising higher around them. The air grew cooler and the light dimmed. Strange shapes appeared on the rocks, ancient carvings of people, animals, and circles. The soldiers stared at them in silence. "What do they mean?" one man asked. Nantan touched one of the carvings gently. "They tell stories of the earth and sky. They mark places where the old spirits walk." The men said nothing more. They moved on quietly, almost afraid to make noise. After another hour, they came to a dry riverbed filled with smooth stones. Something glimmered among them. Vance bent down and picked it up. It was a brass button from a uniform stamped with the letters U.S. His heart sank. They were close to where the missing soldiers had been, but still there were no tracks, no footprints, and no bodies. They camped that night near the mouth of the canyon. The men built a small fire, its light flickering against the rocks. The heat of the day was gone, replaced by cool air and the soft sound of crickets. Overhead, the stars came out one by one, bright and endless. As they sat around the fire, one of the younger soldiers, named Carter, spoke in a low voice. "My father used to tell stories about this land," he said. "He said the mountains could hear what you said, that if you talked bad about them, they'd make sure you never left." Another soldier laughed nervously. "You believe that?" Carter shrugged. "After today, I don't know what to believe." Corporal Vance sat quietly, staring into the fire. The flames danced and cracked, sending tiny sparks into the night. He thought of the girl, the way she had run, swift and silent, as if the desert itself had carried her. Maybe she was still out there, watching them now from the shadows. He couldn't explain it, but he felt that she was connected somehow to the land around them, like she belonged to it in a way they never could. Later, when the others were asleep, Vance lay awake, listening to the wind. It whispered softly through the canyon, making shapes in the darkness. Once he thought he heard a faint sound like footsteps on stone, but when he sat up, there was nothing. Just silence. The next morning, they packed their things and moved on. The canyon opened into a wide valley filled with tall grass and strange rock towers that looked almost human in shape. The air felt different here, still and heavy, as if the world were holding its breath. "This place is old," Nantan said quietly. "Older than our people. We should not stay long." They spread out to search the area. One soldier found a small silver locket half buried in the dirt. Inside was a lock of hair. Another found the broken frame of a canteen, but still no sign of the men themselves. It was as if they had simply walked off the earth. By late afternoon, the heat returned. The men were tired and dusty. Captain Doyle had told them to come back if they found nothing by sundown, and now the sky was beginning to turn orange. Vance stood on a ridge looking out over the endless stretch of desert. In the far distance, the mountains shimmered in the haze. Something about the place made his skin prickle. He couldn't explain it, but he felt they were being watched. He scanned the cliffs, the rocks, the grass, nothing moved. Yet the feeling remained. When the sun dipped below the horizon, they turned back toward the fort. The desert changed as the light faded, the colors deepening to purple and gray. Long shadows reached across the ground like fingers. No one spoke during the ride home. They reached Fort Bowie after dark. The other soldiers came out to meet them, their faces hopeful. But one look at Vance told them the truth. They had found nothing. That night the fort was quiet. Even the horses seemed restless, shifting and snorting in their stalls. Some men said they saw strange lights in the distance, like lanterns moving through the hills. Others said they heard laughter carried by the wind, soft and far away. Vance sat alone by the gate, the same place he had stood 2 nights before. He looked out into the wilderness where the moonlight touched the rocks with silver. Somewhere out there, the desert still held its secret. The girl, the missing men, the silence of the mountains, all part of a mystery older than any of them could understand. He whispered to the wind, as if speaking to the land itself. We only wanted to bring them home. But the desert gave no answer. Only the endless stillness of the night. Days turned into weeks after the last search. The desert sun rose and set as always, golden and endless, but something had changed at Fort Bowie. The laughter was gone. The air felt heavier, and the men spoke in low voices as if afraid the land itself was listening. Even the horses seemed uneasy, their ears twitching at every sound from the distant hills. Captain Doyle kept a record of everything, the names of the missing men, the times they left, the exact route they had taken. Each morning he would stand outside his office, look toward the mountains, and sigh. The mountains looked peaceful, blue against the horizon, but everyone at the fort knew better now. Corporal Henry Vance felt the change most of all. He couldn't stop thinking about the young Apache girl, the way she had run, the look in her eyes, the silent strength in her steps. He replayed that moment over and over, trying to understand what it meant. Was she frightened? Was she guiding them somewhere? Or was she leading them away, deeper into something no one should enter? At night, when the wind blew through the canyon, Vance sometimes thought he could hear soft echoes, whispers carried by the air, faint and distant. They were not words he could understand, but they made his heart race. He would step outside, scan the darkness, and find nothing but the stars. One evening, just before sunset, a trader arrived at the fort. He was a thin man with sunburned skin and bright eyes, driving a small wagon filled with goods. He had come from a settlement a few miles east, where Apache families sometimes traded baskets and hides for food. When he heard about the missing soldiers, he nodded slowly. "I heard something out there," he said, setting down a sack of grain. "They say a young Apache girl has been seen near the hills, alone, sometimes at dawn, sometimes at dusk, always near the same ridge." The men at the fort looked at one another. "The same girl?" someone asked. "Maybe," the trader said. "No one dares to get close. She moves like a shadow. The old folks say she's not just a girl anymore. They say the land watches through her eyes." The words made everyone uneasy. Vance didn't want to believe in such things, yet he couldn't ignore the chill that ran through him. He thanked the trader and said nothing more, but that night he dreamed of her, standing among the rocks, her braids swaying in the wind, her face calm and unreadable. When he woke, the dream felt so real that he sat for a long time, staring at the pale light of dawn. Over the next few days, strange stories began to spread. A group of travelers passing near the mountains reported seeing shapes moving along the ridges, figures on horseback that vanished when they looked twice. Another said they found a patch of desert where the air felt cold even under the sun, and where no birds sang. The captain ordered another search, though this time it was not to find the missing soldiers, but to map the area carefully and mark any dangerous trails. He asked for volunteers. Only a few stepped forward, and Vance was among them. When they left the fort, the morning sky was pale blue and the air still. It was quiet enough to hear the crunch of pebbles under their boots. The scouts led them back through the canyons, following old tracks and new ones. They passed the place where the broken rifle had been found, now half covered in dust. A feeling of silence hung over everything, like the world was holding its breath. By midday, they reached a high ridge that looked down into a wide basin filled with scrub and tall grass. In the middle of it stood a single tree, old and twisted. Around it, the earth was dark, darker than the ground anywhere else. One of the scouts stopped and pointed. "That place is not for us," he said quietly. "It is where the old ones rest." The captain hesitated, then nodded. They turned away, but Vance lingered for a moment, staring at the dark patch of earth. He didn't know why, but it made him think of the missing soldiers, of their laughter before they disappeared, and of the silence that followed. That night they camped near the base of the ridge. The stars came out bright and clear, and the desert looked almost peaceful again. The men sat around a small fire, eating quietly. The warmth felt good after the cool wind that blew down from the hills. After a while, one of the scouts began to speak in a low tone. "Long ago," he said, "there was a girl who ran into these mountains to escape men from the east. They wanted to take her away from her family. She ran so far that even her people could not find her. They say the spirits of the mountains took her in and made her their own. Since then, when someone chases a child of the land, the mountains remember." The fire crackled softly as the men listened. No one laughed or interrupted. Even the captain stayed silent, his face pale in the glow of the flames. When the story ended, the desert felt colder. The men lay down one by one, pulling their blankets tight, but Vance stayed awake. He watched the fire until it burned low, then turned his eyes toward the dark line of the hills. For a moment he thought he saw something small, white like cloth or skin, move between the rocks. It was gone as soon as he blinked. The next morning the air was hazy. They started back toward the fort, following a different route. On the way they passed a narrow ravine with smooth stone walls. As they rode through it, the sound of hooves echoed strangely. It almost sounded like more horses were following behind them, though when they looked, there was no one there. They reached the fort by late afternoon. The men were quiet, tired, and thoughtful. The captain made his report, then dismissed them. That evening, as the sun sank behind the mountains, a warm orange glow spread across the land. For a moment, the desert looked soft, almost kind, but as the light faded, a deep stillness returned. Later that night, the trader came back through the fort, heading east again. He stopped to speak with Vance before leaving. "You went into the hills?" he asked. "Yes," Vance replied. "We didn't find anything." The trader looked toward the mountains, his face thoughtful. "Maybe you weren't meant to." He paused, then added, "You know, some folks say the missing men are still out there. Not alive, not gone, just part of the land now. Like the wind and the sand." Vance felt the hair on his arms rise. "What do you mean?" The trader smiled faintly. "This desert has its own memory, Corporal. Some things never leave it." Then he tipped his hat and rode off into the dusk. That night a soft rain fell, a rare gift in the desert. The sound was gentle, almost musical. The men at the fort slept more peacefully than they had in weeks. But Vance lay awake, listening. In the rhythm of the rain, he thought he heard something else. Footsteps, faint and steady, walking through the canyon beyond the walls. He rose quietly and stepped outside. The world was silver under the moonlight, the wet ground shining softly. The rain had stopped and the air smelled clean and new. In the distance, at the edge of the hills, he saw a small figure standing still. It was the shape of a girl, her long braid glimmering in the moonlight. Vance didn't move. He just watched. The girl turned her head slowly as if she knew he was there. For a moment, their eyes seemed to meet across the empty space. Then, just as quietly, she stepped back and disappeared among the rocks. When the first light of morning came, Vance was still standing there, the memory of her face clear in his mind. He knew she was real. Real as the desert wind, real as the silence that followed. And deep inside, he began to understand what the scouts had meant. The wilderness was not empty. It had a spirit of its own, and sometimes it called back those who did not listen. The year turned and time passed slowly at Fort Bowie. The memory of the missing men had become part of daily life, spoken about in quiet tones, like a story no one dared to forget. The desert outside the fort looked the same as always, endless, golden, and quiet. But for the people living there, it was no longer just land. It had become something sacred, something that watched and listened. Corporal Henry Vance still thought often of the girl. Every night before closing his eyes, he would picture her standing in the moonlight, her long braid shining, her eyes steady and calm. He couldn't explain why that image stayed with him, but it did. As though she carried a secret he was meant to understand. Months later, when the Army sent a new group of surveyors to map the area, the captain asked Vance to go with them. He didn't want to, Part of him wished never to enter those canyons again, but duty was duty. "You know this land better than anyone now," the captain said. And so he went. The team consisted of Vance, 2 other soldiers, and 3 surveyors from Tucson, men with measuring tools, notebooks, and curious eyes. They set out early, riding along the familiar trail that led past the spring and into the canyons. The morning was calm, with a thin mist still hanging over the ground. One of the surveyors, a man named Daniels, was full of energy. "They say this land hides gold," he said cheerfully. "Maybe we'll find more than just rocks." Vance didn't answer. He had heard that kind of talk before, and he knew the desert did not give up its secrets easily. The scouts had once told him that people who came here with greed in their hearts were the first ones the land forgot. By noon, the group had reached a high plateau. From there, they could see miles in every direction, dry riverbeds winding through the sand, lonely cliffs glowing red in the sunlight, and mountains rising like old spirits from the earth. It was beautiful and silent. They stopped to eat under a cluster of mesquite trees. The surveyors spread out their maps, marking the routes they planned to follow. Vance walked a little way off, gazing down into a canyon below. A thin trail led into the shadows, the same one he remembered from the last search. His chest tightened as he stared at it. Daniels noticed. "You've been here before?" he asked. "Yes," Vance said quietly. "Once, we didn't find what we were looking for." Daniels smiled, not catching the tone in his voice. "Well, maybe we'll have better luck." The afternoon passed slowly. They climbed down into the canyon, measuring, drawing, and writing notes. The surveyors were excited about every rock and ridge, but Vance moved carefully, his eyes always scanning the land. He felt a strange calmness mixed with unease, as though the desert was watching them again. As the sun began to lower, they came upon something unexpected. Tucked between 2 cliffs was a small hidden clearing. The grass there was greener than anywhere else they had seen, and in the middle stood a circle of stones, perfectly arranged. It didn't look natural. "What is this?" one of the men whispered. Vance knelt to touch one of the stones. They were smooth and cool, shaped by careful hands. "It's Apache," he said. "A sacred place." The surveyors looked at each other uncertainly. "Should we mark it on the map?" Daniels asked. Vance shook his head. "No, some things are better left as they are." The group camped not far from the clearing that night. The sky was wide and full of stars. A soft breeze passed through the canyon, carrying the scent of dry sage. The men sat around their small fire, talking quietly, but the longer they stayed, the more uneasy they felt. The night seemed too still. Once they thought they heard faint music, like humming carried by the wind. It came and went, soft as breath. Daniels laughed nervously. "Probably just the wind through the rocks," he said. But no one replied. Later, when everyone had gone to sleep, Vance sat awake, watching the fire die down. The moonlight spilled across the canyon floor, silver and cold. He turned his eyes toward the stone circle. For a moment, he thought he saw someone standing there, small and slender, the outline of a girl. She was facing him, but her face was shadowed. He blinked, and the image was gone. Morning came with a pale light. The men packed their things and prepared to move on. As they left the canyon, Vance looked back one last time. The stone circle stood silent and unchanged, but something about it seemed different, as if the stones themselves were watching them go. They continued their work for 2 more days, mapping ridges and valleys. Everything went smoothly until the 3rd evening, when a sudden dust storm swept through the area. The wind howled, turning the air thick and yellow. The men shouted to one another, trying to stay together. When the storm finally passed, the land was quiet again. Too quiet. The air felt heavy, and the light had a strange glow. 2 of the surveyors looked pale, their hands shaking slightly. "I thought I saw someone walking beside us," one said. "A girl. She was there for a second, then gone." Vance's heart beat faster. He didn't say anything, but he knew they had seen what he had seen before. That night, the group set up camp near a dry riverbed. The fire burned low as the men sat close together, speaking little. Every few minutes, someone would glance over their shoulder, as if expecting to see a shadow move. After a while, Daniels broke the silence. "You know," he said softly, "my grandfather used to tell stories about this land. He said the spirits here protect the mountains. Anyone who tries to take what isn't theirs will never find their way home." No one laughed. Vance stared into the fire, the orange light flickering across his face. "Maybe your grandfather was right," he said. The next morning, when they began to pack, one of the surveyors noticed something strange. Near their campfire, the sand had patterns in it. Small, circular shapes that looked like footprints, too small to belong to any of the men. They led away from the fire, toward the rocks. "Do you see that?" the man whispered. Vance bent to look. His chest tightened again. "Leave it," he said quietly. "Don't follow." They finished their work by afternoon and returned to the fort. The maps were complete, and the surveyors were eager to leave. They said the land was beautiful but unsettling, and they were glad to be done with it. When they left the next morning, Vance stood by the gate and watched them ride away. He had a strange feeling, one he couldn't name. Something told him the story wasn't over yet. A few weeks later, news came from Tucson. One of the surveyors, Daniels, had fallen ill soon after returning. Before he passed away, he had spoken of dreams. Dreams of a young Apache girl who stood by a river watching him in silence. In every dream, she would raise her hand as if to say something, but no sound came out. When Vance heard this, he sat quietly for a long time. He looked out toward the mountains, their blue shapes soft in the distance. The wind brushed across his face, warm and dry. He thought of the girl again, of the way she seemed to appear and disappear like the desert itself. Maybe she was never meant to be found. Maybe she was part of the land, a spirit, a story, a memory that would never fade. That night, as the moon rose over the canyons, Vance walked out beyond the fort walls. The desert was still and silver, every shadow deep and clear. Somewhere far away, a soft sound echoed. Not words, but a melody, light as air. He stopped and listened. It was the same song he had heard long ago in the wind, the song of the wilderness. It was beautiful and haunting, full of both sadness and peace. He knew in that moment that the desert remembered everything. The laughter, the silence, the chase, and the girl who ran into the wild. The story was not about loss anymore. It was about how the land keeps those who belong to it and how it never forgets. Years passed quietly after the last expedition. Fort Bowie remained standing, its walls sun-faded and worn by the desert wind. Some of the soldiers left, replaced by new faces who did not know the full story, but those who had been there during the time of the disappearance carried the memory deep inside them. It was no longer spoken aloud. It had become a kind of silence that everyone respected. Corporal Henry Vance had grown older. His hair had begun to turn gray and his hands were rough from years of work. Yet the image of the Apache girl had never left his thoughts. Sometimes he wondered if she had been real at all or if she was something the desert had shown them to teach a lesson. Either way, she had changed him. After leaving the army, Vance decided to stay in Arizona. He built a small home not far from the old fort, where the land was quiet and the sky stretched wider than the sea. He spent his days tending a small garden, reading old books and watching the sunset turn the desert gold. He found peace in the silence. Sometimes travelers passed through, ranchers, traders, or people searching for stories of the old frontier. They often asked him about the missing soldiers, the wild canyons, and the Apache tribes that had once roamed the hills. Vance always spoke kindly, but he never told the whole story. He would only say, "There are places in this land that remember more than we do." One evening, a young writer from the East stopped by his home. The man was eager, full of curiosity. He had heard tales about the mysterious girl and the soldiers who disappeared. "I'm collecting stories of the old days," he said. "People still talk about the Apache girl who led men into the wilderness. Do you believe it really happened?" Vance smiled faintly. "Yes," he said softly. "It happened. But it wasn't what people think." The writer leaned forward. "Then what was it?" Vance looked toward the mountains, their peaks red in the fading light. "It was a reminder," he said. "The desert is alive. It has a spirit and it protects its own. Sometimes when we forget to respect that, it reminds us." The young man nodded slowly, not fully understanding but sensing that the older man's words carried weight. He thanked Vance and left before nightfall, promising to write about the story someday. When he was gone, the house grew quiet again. The desert outside glowed under the moonlight, soft and silver. Vance sat by the window for a long time, lost in thought. He remembered the laughter of the young soldiers, the dust rising behind their boots the moment the girl turned and ran. He could still see her dark braids swinging and hear the echo of their voices fading into the canyons. He had searched for them, prayed for them, and in the end, accepted that they had become part of the land. Maybe the mountains had taken them not out of anger, but to keep them, to fold them into the stories that the wind still whispered. Years later, long after Vance had grown old, a group of travelers exploring the same mountains found something unusual. Deep inside a hidden ravine, they came across pieces of old metal, half buried under sand, buttons, belt buckles, and the remains of uniforms. Nearby, they found a small campfire ring made of stones and a charm necklace of shells and beads. The discovery reached Tucson, and from there the newspapers. The story of the lost soldiers of Fort Bowie spread again, stirring old memories. Reporters wrote about ghosts, secrets, and ancient curses. But among the Apache people living near the mountains, the story was told differently. An elder woman who had heard the story from her grandmother spoke to the reporters. "The girl they chased was one of ours," she said. "She was brave and wise beyond her years. When the men followed her into the mountains, she led them to a place where the earth listens. There the wind told her what to do. She asked the land to keep them safe, and it did. They are still there, safe in the heart of the desert." The words were simple, but they carried peace, not fear. The people listening felt a strange calm. Maybe the story wasn't about loss after all. Maybe it was about belonging. When the news reached Vance, he was sitting on his porch wrapped in a blanket. He read the article slowly, his eyes soft with memory. Then he folded the paper and set it aside. The wind brushed against his face, warm and gentle, and for a moment he thought he could hear soft laughter carried on it, light, quick, and familiar. That night, he dreamed again. In his dream, he stood in a wide desert plain. The sky was deep blue, filled with stars, and the mountains glowed softly in the moonlight. Across the sand, he saw her, the girl. She looked the same as she had all those years ago, young and still, her eyes calm and knowing. She walked toward him, her steps silent. When she reached him, she didn't speak. She simply smiled, a small, peaceful smile that held both kindness and understanding. Then she turned and pointed toward the mountains, where the peaks shimmered like silver in the starlight. Vance followed her gaze. In the distance, he saw the faint outlines of 5 men standing near the canyon ridge. They looked young again, their faces gentle and unafraid. One of them raised his hand as if to wave. When Vance woke, the morning light was soft and golden. He felt rested, lighter than he had in years. Outside, the desert stretched endless and bright, alive with color and sound. Birds called from the cactus tops, and a soft wind carried the scent of blooming sage. He stepped out onto the porch, took a long breath, and smiled. "Thank you," he whispered. To the land, to the wind, to whatever unseen spirit had kept its promise. Not long after that morning, the people at the nearby settlement found his home quiet. They said he had passed peacefully in his sleep, his face calm, his hands folded as if resting after a long journey. When they buried him, they chose a small hill facing the mountains he had never stopped watching. The desert seemed to honor him that day. The sky clear, the wind soft, the air still and bright. In time, his story and the story of the Apache girl became one. Travelers still speak of her, the mysterious girl who vanished into the wilderness and led others into the heart of the desert. Some say she was a protector. Others believe she was a spirit born from the land itself. And on quiet nights, when the moon is full, some claim they can see a light moving along the ridges, one a soft, flickering glow like a lantern carried by gentle hands. They say it is the girl, walking the old paths, watching over those who wander too far. The wilderness remains silent, but alive. It remembers every sound, every step, every story. The mountains still stand strong, their red faces glowing at sunrise. The wind still whispers through the canyons, carrying the soft music of a memory that never fades. No one truly knows what happened to the soldiers who chased the Apache girl into the wild. But those who listen closely, those who feel the breath of the desert on their skin, understand that the land keeps what it loves, and that some mysteries are not meant to be solved, only respected, and so the story lives on, not as a tale of loss, but of harmony, of how the earth protects its own and how sometimes the wild, quiet heart of the world reminds us that we are guests here, not masters. Far from the noise of towns and the paths of men, the desert still glows under the same endless sky. Somewhere among the cliffs and canyons where the wind hums and the shadows dance, a girl's footsteps still echo, light, steady, and free.